their social science research. I'm Doug Petty. I work with Ramsey County, and we like this to be a networking meeting where people can connect with other people, learn about what other people are doing, what methods that they might employ in their own work. So, if you don't mind, we'll just go around the room and you can introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Neil Young from I do economic analysis with the Department of Employment and Economic Development.
My name is Ed Chadwick. I used to be an economist at Wells Fargo Bank.
I'm Andrea Rudolph, and I've been hired with I'm Clark Fickler, and the Minnesota Contract.
Jeff Schneider, also city former student of Wilbur Yankee. 20 years ago.
Yeah. Hey, Rosenberg with Minnesota Housing Partners. Amanda Hollis with Washington County. I'm Jane Vanderpool, and I'm with Dakota County.
Peter Matt with Wilder Research and Company.
Damian Moore with Management Now Development.
Sam Coren with Minnesota.
Our customer management now. Done meetings anyway.
Introduce yourself.
Sure. Michael Peterson, State Demographic Center.
Megan Dayton. I'm Carrie Jenner, Department of Education.
Okay. And one favor I have to ask is, if you didn't RSVP, if you wouldn't mind just signing this sheet at some time, and you can either email or add you to our email. So you know what's coming up. So with that, to get started, so today we have a great presentation. Dr. Laura Palamokidis is a state economist but has been a professor at the University of Minnesota for 15 years and has worked on tax policy as her area of expertise. And for the last 2 years, she has also served as a state economist doing economic forecasting and budget projections for the state of Minnesota. And she's going to be presenting on the state of the Minnesota economy for us. So, help me welcome you.
Thank you, Doug, for the introduction and for inviting me. I see that a bunch of us could have carpooled over from Centennial. You have to leave the office to meet people who live in your office. So I am going to I'm going to talk about Minnesota's economic outlook, so the state of Minnesota's economy, but I am interspersing my Minnesota Outlook slides with some slides about how we do the economic outlook and the revenue forecast. So it's a little different from what I usually do, and I'm hoping that it works smoothly, but the idea is to help you understand how we do it while at the same time talking about what we've done and what we're saying. I'm happy to take questions at any time. We can so jump right in with anything in detail. Sometimes when I present something like this, I actually have a second slide with all the same title information with the University of Minnesota logos on it to demonstrate my dual roles. I am a professor of applied economics at the University of Minnesota in addition to being a state economist. So I'm kind of speaking from both hats, wearing both hats today. A little bit of background about my role and the role of the Economic Analysis Unit at MND. So the state economist leads the Economic Analysis Unit at MND. You can find information about us on the MND website /forecast. There's a description under Contact Economic Analysis. You can see a bio for me as well as bios for the other two economists. We're a pretty small office. Three of us, three full-time employees, 2 economists and a computer analyst, and then me, and I'm technically part-time. And then in addition to information about us, of course, you can find information about our budget and economic forecast. Our office is responsible for the revenue side of the budget forecast. There is also an expenditure side of the budget forecast, and the budget division at MND is responsible for that. And just to show you this, so yes, I'm also this too. Hopefully we will see Minnesota. So some of the things that we do. Twice yearly, and most of what we do is statutorily defined, but twice yearly we do revenue and economic forecast. And so that's the November forecast and then the February update. The November forecast is due by the end of the first week of December, so it's often it looks like the December forecast. February forecast is due at the end of February. And so that forecast is the starting point for the budget process when we're in a budget year. So where the legislature is designing a budget for a biennium. The November forecast comes out, and then the governor prepares his or her proposed budget based on that forecast. Then we do an update in February, because economic conditions may have changed, we've gotten more information, and then that is the formal starting point, the formal line or number to which the legislature's budget. And so we presented a forecast in February 2015 where we updated the forecast for the current biennium, fiscal year 14-15, and then and in addition provided a forecast for the next biennium, which is 16-17. And the legislature and the governor are in the current activity as the legislature is choosing what the budget will be based on the forecast numbers.
Well, let's say a quick question. Yes, everyone. As you said, the tax expenditure budget is done in the budget division. Why are those two not coming out together? I mean, the tax expenditure budget comes out every couple of years for the next couple of bienniums. Clearly, for us to really budget, we need to know both sides of the budget, both the revenue and what we're spending on tax write-offs.
Okay, so to be clear, the expenditure side of the budget that we produce is straight spending, direct spending, not tax expenditure. Okay, so the tax expenditure budget comes out from the Minnesota Department of Revenue, and you're right. There have been conversations about how to fold that into the budget process. That was one of the recommendations of the Tax Expenditure Review Commission that I was on, and so it's up to the legislature to decide how to fold that in. We certainly recognize on the commission that it wouldn't be trivial, but it is important to look at not only the direct spending on particular programs, but the indirect spending that we're doing through tax expenditures, and to have those conversations together. So I agree with the voters, but hasn't happened yet. The recommendations were published a few years ago. So that's the big kahuna from my office, is a credible single forecast that is accepted by all parties, and that has been the case for many, many years. In addition, we do quarterly revenue and economic updates. So 4 times a year, we produce a short report that tells you how economic conditions have changed since the last time we talked to you, the last time we reported, and also shows how actual receipts compare to our most recent forecast. So those are due on the 10th of the month, and the quarterly month, we've got one due Friday. So on Friday, you'll see our April economic update that will tell you, here's how the economy is looking now, the U.S. economy typically, and here's how receipts compare to our February forecast.
You know what time that will be coming out?
Not yet. Don't count on it early on Friday. I'm thinking it might be later on Friday, partly because I'm here right now. We try to get it out midday, but you know, a lot of things have to be checked and double checked. And it does get posted on our website though, to this /forecast website. In addition, the legislature requires monthly revenue reports. Okay, so you can see kind of how this builds. The legislature gets this, and then report to us more often than that. Give us quarterly information. Actually, we want to know it monthly. So what we do monthly is just a short memo. It's technically a memo to the governor, but it's made public. And it doesn't have a whole lot of explanation, but it's just comparing monthly receipts to the forecast. So we're producing a revenue forecast for a biennium, but then we're distributing that money across months so that we can say, we expected X number of dollars in January, and here's what we got by major tax type. Usually a little bit of explanation there if we have something we want to say. But always a lot of caution about the monthly numbers because cash flows are hard to predict, and the accounting systems, there may be things going on with accounting systems that make things turn out not quite as we expect. But anyway, we do that as well. When we're not completely focused on the forecast, we also do research analysis and analysis to support forecasting. So during this time now and through the summer and early fall, we're working on other reports, and we're working on models, and we're learning more about the economy and testing equations, things like that. One thing that our office does now is produces an annual report analyzing the volatility of the state tax system. And that's something that came out of the State Budget Trend Study Commission from a few years back when Tom Simpson was state economist. He and Matt Schuffner, who was an economist on my staff, did analyze the state revenue system for volatility, which components of the system are the most and least volatile. And that attracted a lot of attention and led to a recommendation for the size of the budget reserve. And so now it's in statute that the target number for the state budget reserve is based on our analysis of revenue volatility. So we produced that report currently, it's due in January, and it leads to it includes the recommendation or the target for the state budget reserve. So it means that statutorily the state targeted budget reserve is based on analysis of the state's revenue volatility. And finally, we do outreach education about the state economy. So I'm MMB primary spokesperson on the state economy, and so I do a lot of public speaking to a variety of groups. So that's our role. Talk a bit about how we do the forecast, and as I said, intersperse it with some of the slides that I normally use to present the forecast and the economy. So the state revenue forecast starts with the U.S. economic outlook. We are not macroeconomic forecasters, and so we receive a U.S. economic outlook from a consulting firm, from IHS Economics. So IHS puts out monthly macroeconomic forecasts that include a full set of macroeconomic variables that are internally consistent with one another. So we don't have to, we're not just starting with a GDP number and then figuring everything else out. It's a full set of data. They produce a baseline, which is what they think is most likely to happen, and they also produce an optimistic and pessimistic scenario. Yep.
Curious, why don't you use CBO for your national economic outlook?
I'm not sure. Why don't we use CBO? The Congressional Budget Office. CBO's economic forecast tend to not be nearly as detailed as what these forecasters provide, because they're providing data to all sorts of firms, all sorts of companies, and so they have lots of detailed data that I'm sure CBO doesn't bother with. Pardon me?
Industry.
Yes, and different types of spending and really small categories of spending, and CBO doesn't need that for their purposes. And CBO tends to be an outlier when you look at the economic forecast of a number of different firms. CBO tends to be an outlier. So this is over the years, this company has changed names a lot. They have their forecasts have served us well. Twice before each forecast, we have a meeting. We convene a meeting of our Council of Economic Advisors. That council is made up of economists, academic and corporate economists, some and Federal Reserve economists. Some are located in different parts of the state. They come together. They evaluate the IHS economic outlook. This is roughly what I thought it would look like, or I think they might be a little overly optimistic on this number, or I think their explanation of this number is not quite what I would have expected. So they give us a qualitative evaluation. We have a conversation about it, and they also share Minnesota-specific information. Here's what's going on in Blues. Here's what's going on in Rochester. Here's what I hear about the mining industry. And so those meetings occur while we're preparing the forecast. So to vet that macro forecast. And it helps us understand how much risk we are assuming based on the U.S. macro forecast. So, or there's not much risk associated with that, so then it's mostly Minnesota specific risk. And then those baseline variables are used as inputs for a Minnesota economic model that we developed, and also for a state tax model. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But at forecast time, and in all of our forecast documents, there is a lot of focus on the U.S. economy. Minnesota's economy is closely tied to the U.S. economy. We have, if you look at the distribution of employment across industrial sectors for Minnesota, it looks very similar to the distribution for the U.S. We don't have a lot of Minnesota-specific employment risk, mostly U.S. employment risk. And so, what is happening in the U.S. matters to Minnesota. And the way that we typically illustrate what's happening in the U.S. is by real GDP growth. That's what this chart shows. Now, there's a caution. This is real GDP growth is the way we typically talk about things are getting better, things are getting worse, things have improved, things are looking good, things aren't looking so good. It's usually through real GDP growth. But we don't tax GDP. So it is not always the case that when the forecast for real GDP growth goes down, our forecast for Minnesota revenue goes down, and vice versa. So it becomes a tricky communication task for us to explain what's going on in the U.S. economy and how that might affect Minnesota, but then to also, if there's a disconnect, talk about the disconnect. That even though the U.S. economy economic outlook has improved, Minnesota's revenue outlook has not, or vice versa. So it's a lot of conversations, a lot of thinking through why the GDP outlook has changed and what that might mean for us. Let me give you an example about the revenue story. We have an income tax, of course, in Minnesota that we tax capital gains income, which is a very volatile income source, so that adds a lot of volatility to the individual income tax. But capital gains realizations are not measured in GDP. So capital gains can go up, and that will have an impact on revenues, but it wouldn't affect GDP. Vice versa, capital gains GDP could change, and capital gains not change, and revenue is going to change. So that's one of the caveats, and I'll talk about GDP. Because we do 2 forecasts a year, we are usually talking about how the current forecast compares to the last. So our charts are usually November to February, February to November. So this is the February 2015 outlook, so we're comparing to the November 14 outlook. And what happened to the IHS forecast between November and February is that they increased their real GDP growth outlook overall, but most of the growth comes in the early years here. So if you look at levels of GDP between 14 and it's up, even though we have a couple of years where it's the same and one where the growth rate is lower. So most of the growth most of the change came in the early years, and most of it's in 2015. That's a pretty big jump in their expectations for real GDP growth, and that was largely driven by changes in their expectations for consumer spending. So this became part of our narrative. That change in consumer spending influences what we expect to see happen in sales tax receipts in Minnesota. And I'll talk a bit about forecasting sales tax. So why GDP changed becomes an important part of the narrative. In this case, it was largely, 2015 was largely because of consumer spending. Some of that was driven by lower gasoline prices and consumers being able to divert some of their resources toward other spending. Not all of it. Some of it was also due to a better job environment and better consumer confidence.
Doesn't IHS produce a state economy and state growth economic outlook?
Yeah. Some states contract with them for that. And so they do that for some states, and I believe it would be possible for us to do that too. But we choose to create our own Minnesota economic model. Okay, what else about U.S. economic outlook? Okay, so if usually the first slide that we present on forecast day, just to set the ideas that the U.S. economy, expectations for the U.S. economy are improving or not improving since the last forecast. And one of the difficult communication points is growth is accelerating, but not as much as they thought before. So it's the question of the outlook has improved versus the outlook has deteriorated. Even in the old outlook, growth was increasing. We just got this jump here, so sometimes that gets to be a little tricky. One of the things that influenced our story in February and is still influencing the U.S. and the Minnesota economy right now was unexpected. A year ago, it was unexpected even as late as last summer, was the strength of the U.S. dollar. How strong the U.S. dollar is, especially against the euro and other the currencies of other trading partners. And that, along with the unexpectedly low oil prices, both had significant impact on the U.S. economic outlook. And so one of the things that we emphasized when we presented the forecast in February was that the strong dollar is going to slow U.S. export growth. So it makes U.S. exports more expensive abroad. And so that means that for Minnesota, we then sort of put on the watch list those industries that depend on exports, manufacturing, mining, logging, agriculture, that we should expect growth to slow in all of those places. You can see the difference between the November and February outlook for export growth is really quite dramatic. Okay, so we start with the U.S. We talk about the U.S., but there's always the hedge that just because it's happening at the U.S. level doesn't mean that you can necessarily translate directly to our revenue. Then we move to a Minnesota economic model. So U.S. economic outlook informs a Minnesota economic model. So the stuff that IHS sends us that we use in our models: industry output, productivity, factor prices, cyclical factors, industry employment, consumption details. They've got all these little details of types of consumption. That matters a lot for the sales tax, because our sales tax has a lot of different exemptions, and so getting that information about specific kinds of consumption is very important. Interest rates, personal income, and components of personal income, some demographics and housing factors. So, and housing indicators. So those influence what we do with how we estimate Minnesota employment and income by industry. We also get Minnesota-specific information from the State Demographic Center, so that our population numbers are consistent with theirs, unless for some reason we decided to do something slightly different. The population and household information feeds into our Minnesota housing model. So our housing model is driven by household formation, which means household formation is when people who are living together separate and form separate households. So when the economy is improving, when the economy is doing poorly, people tend to live together to save on costs, and students tend to stay with their parents. When the economy improves, they all separate and start their own households. That generates demand for housing. And so that we have a forecast for household formation, and then a forecast for new homes, and that feeds into a forecast for construction employment. And that's Minnesota-specific information.
Well, with the housing model, it seems like that's changed with the whole foreclosure, where fear is a much larger factor now in people making that choice to get into homeownership, as well as we are the third worst state in the country. We were the worst last year in disparity in homeownership between white and non-white, and really not providing those opportunities for people of color to spend with American Indians to get into homeownership. Obviously, something I'm working on at the Capitol, so obviously something that I'll bring up wherever I am. But it really is impacting our economy, as far as we do have like 250,000 vacant units in the state right now that we could get people into homeownership, but we're just not putting the dollars into the folks that are ready to go into homeownership. 40% of the emerging homeownership market are people of color, are non-white right now. Well, we think it's hurting our economy.
the reason I bring it up, the whole idea of household formation and the housing stock and demand, is because it does matter in the economy, and we have had disappointing growth in household formations at the U.S. level and the Minnesota level for the last couple of years. And the explanations are the kinds of things that you talked about, that the generation of people who are at the right age to be buying homes right now have a higher propensity to live with others, to live with their parents and not buy homes, and a higher propensity to rent. And so it matters. We do a current law forecast, and so we aren't thinking, well, what if it says, the proposals that you're working on pass, then things will change our forecast. But so we don't look ahead to what policies might be enacted. But I certainly, we're on the same page that it matters and it's affecting the economy. Yes. Yes, and there's speculation. Other economists here may have looked at some of this stuff too. That sort of a debate about whether this generation of mid-20s, late 20s age people are significantly different from previous generations because they are living with their parents longer and a higher share of them are. Are they fundamentally different people, or is it just that they came of age during the recession and didn't get their job opportunities and have higher student loan debt, and so that changed their perception? Is it a taste thing, or is it a bad luck thing, bad luck timing thing? And that matters because do we think that as the economy improves, they're going to go out and buy houses, or do they really just want to live with their parents forever? So we have information about Minnesota's relative labor costs. We aren't just assuming that Minnesota's labor costs are the same as the U.S. We also have information. We need information for sure about about employment and labor, and we estimate then employment by industry, and we break the economy down into industrial sectors, the ones that we think we need to particularly look at. And we get wage income by industry. And then in addition, we're estimating proprietor income and transfer income, other forms types of personal income. And we think of talking about it, go back a little. We're generating this information with a series of econometric equations. It's about 68 equations where we're using the U.S. data and the Minnesota-specific data and forecasting employment and wages for each sector. So it links this Minnesota-specific dynamics with the U.S. dynamics. The model is designed to be straightforward. It is fairly easy to understand. We use most of these regressions are run in eViews. IHS, the company that owns IHS also owns eViews, so the data sets and the equations work really well together. We have access to IHS's forecasting equations. So sometimes when we're doing some forecasting and we're using some of their variables and it's not making much sense, there's something we don't get, we can dig into, open up their equations and see, oh, they got this coefficient in there. I'm not sure that's right for us, and we can change things if we want. We have access to them, so we can ask them questions as well. So the model is based on these identifiable and stable relationships between the U.S. and the Minnesota economy. The result is short-term forecasts with quarterly data, so we forecast everything quarterly for employment, wages, and the personal income components. And then those data are fed, and I'll show you some of that in a minute, are fed into our models of the state tax revenue. And when we do this, so this is all, the IHS forecast comes out, and then we have 2 or 3 weeks to produce the full forecast document. So we're running these equations, and then we sit down and we look at them all. So it's not it's getting the equations is a fairly turnkey system, but we don't end up with the final number through a turnkey system. We're evaluating them all qualitatively. We're looking at each equation, looking at each industry, and saying, oh, wait, you know what? We also have this outside information about what's going on in the mining industry, and so we just take some numbers down there. Or we have some outside information about, so if we'd known that Target was going to lay people off, that would be something that that we might have put in there. So there's a constant decision rule about, is the economic activity that we're hearing about in the press something that is the normal course of business and really is just sort of part of our model, or is it something that's extraordinary? And we really do need to make an off-model adjustment for it. When we talk about Minnesota's economy, though, we don't usually talk about it in the terms that I just did. We're usually using the unemployment rate as a measure, sort of taking the temperature of the economy. Use this as our temperature gauge of how well the economy is doing. And but again, just like with GDP, we like to use it because it's comparable to other states. We can look at it over time. We can compare it to the U.S. It's even better than GDP that way because we don't have great measures of state GDP. And so that's good. We can look at it over time. We compare it to other states. We compare it to the U.S. It does tell us roughly how the labor market is going. But we know that there are limitations to the headline unemployment rate. In addition, we don't tax unemployment, or the inverse of that. And so just because unemployment is coming down doesn't necessarily mean that personal income is going up. So the caveats, there are caveats there too. Let me talk a bit about, this is the headline unemployment rate. And so the gap, the U.S. is the light line, and so this is the dark line. This sort of almost always below the U.S. And the gap now is a healthy, close to 2 points. The vertical lines are U.S. recession. So another thing I'd like to point out here is that if you look at the expansion period, the recovery and expansion periods, the white space between the recessions, in the last expansion period, at the bottom point of the unemployment rate was 3.9%. We're below that now. So we're already below the low point of the previous expansion. And in the big recovery and expansion here, we've got 2.5%. So we're between those points now. What does that mean? I don't know, but it means we've recovered and we're definitely in an expansionary period, but it's possible for the unemployment rate to go farther. It's done so before. On the other hand, this expansion is wider, longer than the average post-war expansion. And so this expansion that we're in now is getting a little old. It doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to turn into a recession, but it does mean you want to be alert to red flags about recession. So the caveats about headline unemployment rates, these people can do this better than I can, but you know that while we like to look at aggregates and averages because they're comparable across different regions and you can look at them easily over time, aggregates and averages tend to mask important differences between groups. So while Minnesota's unemployment rate is 3.7%, the black unemployment rate in Minnesota, I think it's, I don't know if I have the most recent ones, but is 10.7% or something like that. The ratio between the white unemployment rate and the black unemployment rate is very high for Minnesota. So there are groups of people, Hispanic workers, American Indian workers, African American workers in Minnesota, for whom Minnesota's economy is now not outperforming the U.S. economy. Now, those unemployment rates have fallen from their peaks, and in some of the cases they're lower than the U.S. level, but nevertheless, that's one of the, to look at it, to sort of look at it from an asset standpoint, that's where the pockets of potential employment still are in our economy. We have a tightening labor market in Minnesota. We have high rates of job vacancies, but we still do have some pockets of unemployment, and that's largely among workers of color. So that's a place to look if you're a potential employer trying to attract people. Another way, so that's one way to drill down below the headline unemployment rate, is to look at different groups of workers. Another way is to look at other measures of labor underutilization. Other measures include, for instance, marginally attached workers. So workers who are not counted as unemployed because they haven't been looking for work during the survey period, but they also don't have a job. They don't have a job, but they would work if they could find. They say they would be willing to work, but they're not currently looking. So they're not counted as unemployed in these numbers. Others are just a second, maybe finish this thought. Others might include part-time workers who would prefer full-time work, so involuntary part-time. Those numbers, the marginally attached and the part-time unemployed, have all been falling, and the marginally attached are at pre-recession levels. I think the part-time involuntary unemployed is very close to pre-recession levels. So Minnesota means we don't have a ton of slack left.
I was just going to say I've been doing some research on more of the U.S., but what I found very interesting, I constantly are hearing about this 93 million people out of the labor force, right?
Yes.
And there's actually a number on the BLS website, and it tells you only 6.5% of those people actually work a job.
Mm-hmm. So the rest are people who are retired. They're left because they're retired. They're on disability.
School,
mm-hmm.
home care, and a couple of things. But yeah, so I mean, it's not this great thing where people say, well, let's get these 93 million people back to work. No, it's like 5.
Yeah. Who actually want to. Now, that can change if economic conditions change, right? So wages get high enough. People people come back from retirement, right? So that can happen. But yeah, the change in the labor force has accompanied, unsurprisingly, demographic change in the aging of the baby boomers. They're retiring out of the labor force. We might be able to pull some of those back in, but most of them are done working. And so the slower growth of the labor force that Demographic Center teaches us about is here to stay. That's not something that's likely to be corrected or changed. So Minnesota is seeing a tightening labor market that not every state is seeing, although a lot of them are. And so that's more the character of talking about labor dynamics in Minnesota. It's more employers trying to figure out how to find workers and how to move workers around the state. And in my view, the employers that will thrive in the future are the ones who can do that, who can find these pockets of workers that want to work, are still unemployed, and are willing to maybe move or be attracted with higher wages. So among
will be for housing.
Sure. Yes.
Because the affordable housing, and I mean the employer's not paying enough for the housing, people are not going to make that move.
Yes.
And the fact is, if you look across the state, the fastest growth is in our non-white population throughout the state. And you just have to figure out that combination of housing and jobs.
The housing thing is a bit of a conundrum to me, because in the towns, the regions where manufacturers in particular are having trouble attracting workers, and they say the problem is that there isn't housing here, and then as an economist I think, okay, that sounds like excess demand for housing, somebody should be building some housing, and the market should resolve this. And then people should move. And I think it's an important question as to why that's not happening. In some cases, I think it's whether there is genuinely a barrier somehow to building the housing, that where there's a role for the public sector to move that barrier, or if there's something else happening that I'm not picking up on. And one of the ideas that makes some sense to me is that in Minnesota, look at places like Roseau and Fergus Falls and places where there are manufacturers that are trying to attract people, there isn't the housing, is that the developers, even though there's currently demand for housing, they're worried about these being one-housing towns. And so they don't want to, even though Polaris is doing fine right now, if they pull out, then you're stuck with an apartment building and nobody in it. so the diverse economy that serves Minnesota so well and makes the state so resilient is very hard, nearly impossible to replicate in a local economy. We have it in the Twin Cities, but you're not going to have it in every small town in northern Minnesota, that diversity. So I think that's something worth thinking about. I like to point out that we're in this low unemployment neighborhood here in Minnesota. So at the same time, we're in an economic expansion that's been expanding for quite a while, and that's pulling our unemployment rate down. We're facing demographic change that's reducing growth in the labor force and bringing baby boomers out of the labor force, and that affects our economy as well. And we are butted up against this economic engine of North Dakota and the Bakken oil region that may have, you may have along the time that it's been developed, may have been drawing workers over and having an impact on our economy as well. We do know anecdotally that there are firms in Minnesota that have taken advantage of opportunities in North Dakota, and many of us have know of people who have gone to North Dakota for work, whether permanently or temporarily. Nobody's actually discerned quantitatively what that's done to our unemployment rate. But for Minnesota, you saw the unemployment rate for Minnesota is almost 2 points below the U.S., and we have the fifth lowest unemployment rate among states right now. And of those 5 states, 2, 3, 4, 5, all but one is in the Midwest. Utah is the other. So we are in this neighborhood, this upper northern middle neighborhood of, we're abutted by low population density states that have low unemployment. And so that's something that I think plays to our advantage in some ways, but also creates a challenge potentially if that's where we think we're going to be drawing workers from. Okay, so building the story of the U.S. economy, Minnesota's economy, tightening labor market. What should you expect with unemployment rates so low and job vacancy rates high? You would expect that if the demand for labor exceeds the supply of labor, that the price of labor should go up. And so we do indeed forecast stronger wage growth for Minnesota and stronger wage growth than what we forecast in November. To be clear, that what we're tracking here is nominal wage and salary disbursement, so it's the total amount of money spent, so it's paychecks, and so that is influenced both by the number of people working and the average wage. So when I talk about wage growth, I think I sometimes confuse people that I'm talking strictly about average wages, but what I mean is total amount of money that people are earning. And so we expected acceleration from 14 to 15 in the November forecast, but we increased our expectations in the February forecast. What kind of information do we use for that? We've got the U.S. macro information. We also use Minnesota-specific information from Indeed, so BLS data, the QCW quarterly census on employment and wages as well. So we can, when we're putting together forecasts, we're looking at how those numbers have come in. But one thing that we do that I don't know that every state does is that we also watch withholding receipts. So the receipts from income tax withholding. And so we're getting closer to real-time information about what's going on with wages in Minnesota. We have a model that takes withholding receipts and then infers from that, or defines out of that, wage growth. And that's part of what's fed into our increased expectations here. Now, it's not a perfect system, though. It depends on, this year we had changes in the withholding tables, and some employers may have not adopted those changes, and that may mess up our signal. So it's not always a perfect signal, but that's where we're headed. So remember, we had increased expectations of consumer spending. We have increased expectations for wage and salary income. I didn't talk about it, but we also had increased expectations for capital gains income. All of that fed into increased expectations for tax revenue, for fiscal year 16-17. So this is our the presentation of the February forecast. These are the revenue sources. This is the total revenue for the biennium, the forecast of total revenue for the biennium, and this is the change since the last forecast. So you hear about the $1.98 billion change. We're responsible for this much of that change. The other side is the prior biennium and spending. But most of it, as usual, most of it is the individual income tax. We talked about the changes in income there, changes in our expectations for income. But the general sales tax, we did its share too. That increased expectations for consumer spending and business spending. We'll talk about that in great detail. So those are the taxes that we forecast. The individual income tax, we used a micro-simulation model or a tax calculator model that uses input individual tax return data, and then we can simulate what tax liability will be if we change parameters in the tax system. The state is a model that's shared between us, the Minnesota Department of Revenue, and the nonpartisan legislative staff. And so we have a professional collegial relationship that crosses all of the government, where we're sharing the model and sharing the parameters and sharing ideas about that tax calculator model. We get a random stratified sample of income tax returns from Minnesota Department of Revenue without any identifiable information. We use economic assumptions. We agree as a cross-agency group what the tax parameters should be, and change the model for that. And so we compute with that future Minnesota income tax liability. So, and we're doing that for 2000. This time around, I think it was 14 through 19 tax years. But tax year liability doesn't tell us what fiscal year revenue is, and so we take tax year liability and we make some decisions about how people are going to pay that tax. So is it going to come in through withholding receipts? Are they going to make estimated tax payments? Are they going to, everybody going to just write a big check on April 15th? That matters. And this was a big learning point for me, switching from being an academic economist doing work on the impact of tax policy to forecasting revenue. One of the big leaps was someone has got to care about not only how much tax people owe, but when they're going to pay it in order to get the fiscal year numbers. And so worrying about cash flow, and was a step I never had to take before, and now I do. So we have a withholding model, and we forecast withholdings. We have an idea of when we think the withholding is going to come in. And then we have another model that helps us understand when estimated tax payments are going to come in. Kind of the residual is those final payments or refunds that show up on April 15th. I guess that's what I just said. Withholding receipts, estimated employment wages come from our Minnesota model, and then we forecast withholding. So I can move forward with that. And it becomes material, because sometimes big chunks of receipts might move across fiscal years and they might move across biennia. And so taxpayer behavior is not just how much are you going to earn, but what kind of income are you going to earn, when are you going to choose to earn it if you can, so you're going to realize capital gains this year or next year, and then when are you going to pay it? And there's a lot, the people who have the most choice about when to pay their taxes and how much really to pay are the people in the highest income brackets, because they're getting income that is proprietary income and capital gains, less just wages. And so that uncertainty is concentrated among the populations the hardest to figure out. So that adds to our challenges. If everybody was simply a wage earner, it would be less complicated. The sales tax, I hinted that our model uses national data to create a simulated Minnesota sales tax base. We have a lot of exemptions. You can't just look at consumer spending or business spending and say that's the sales tax base. And so we do need that micro level of detail of spending in order to figure out what our tax base really is. It changes a lot, so this has to be a versatile model that we can change when things get excluded or added. We link it to Minnesota economic variables. There are things we think, kinds of spending that we think are more important here than in other places. We created simulated tax base. We also, in recent years, in the last decade or so, we've put a lot of work into adjusting for growth in remote sales. So looking at catalog and internet sales. This is just a chart showing the relationship between, the purple is our is the sales tax. Sales tax is the actual sales tax, and then these bold triangles are our synthetic or our simulated sales tax base. So it's just to illustrate that, roughly right a lot of the time, but there's still places where we're going to be off with data. But that's the kind of idea. We're using the historic data for the sales tax, but we're also using the synthetic data.
I'm curious, when Amazon started collecting Minnesota sales tax, is that a pretty significant bump in revenue for the state?
I can't say anything about the tax circumstances of any particular taxpayer, but so I can't directly answer that question. But at the time of the November forecast, we knew that that a large online retailer had announced that they were collecting sales tax from Minnesota customers, and so we incorporated that into our estimate. But you can see, so we're a whole industry that started. I could potentially give you a number, but if it's a taxpayer, then I can't. Yeah.
Well, just to follow up, so your forecast in sales tax, is that assuming the current federal law about internet sales? I mean,
yes.
There's this big lobby, and it seems like it's maybe going to happen at some point, but do you have any of that built into your forecast?
We do, that's a great question. We do a strict current law forecast. So whatever's passed, whatever is law at the time that we sort of draw a line and say we're done and we're ready to do the forecast, that's what we're considering. And we're not speculating about the outcome of any political process or policy process. We also don't speculate about the outcome of court cases or about there are some corporate activities that we will wait until those actually happen before we incorporate them. So we don't think, decide, we think this thing is going to pass. So therefore we're going to put it in the forecast. We wait until it actually happens. That's a good question. But we certainly are watching all of those things, both at the state and the federal level. So another place that this came up is in the Medtronic merger, and that's the potential impact on capital gains of shareholders of Medtronic. So at what point do we decide that, yes, this thing is done, and therefore we would put it in the forecast? Yeah.
Is your comparison for the modeled points versus the actual, is that on if it's on a quarterly, would that be just a 1 quarter out projection compared to the actual, or what would be the time frame across the comparison?
This is the percent change year over year. So each number is, like, this is second quarter 2001. So this is compared to the percent change from second quarter 2000 to second quarter 2001. That's the question.
But are you comparing the forecasted number for each quarterly point?
This is what we had forecasted for that quarter compared to what actually came in that quarter.
So that would have been like the forecast for the forecast you were making for the next coming up quarter, the next quarter out. It's not like a more long term like the no. Quarterly for that you made, the forecast you made a year ago for that quarter. It would be like the quarter prior, the forecast for the next quarter compared to the actual.
I think what this is, that's a good question, but I think this is less looking forward and more, here's what our synthetic sales, we constructed the sales tax base. If we apply our methodology constructing the sales tax base to the data we had in the second quarter of 2001, this is what our sales tax base would have been. But we now know that this what we actually got. Does that help? It's less a forecast and more simulation. When you go out here, you don't have any purple numbers, you have the golds, and then they're all forecasts. Does that make sense? Because we simulated it on forecast levels of spending. What else? Corporate. Corporate is just the most volatile of Minnesota's major taxes. We do this volatility study where we analyze the volatility of the taxes. Corporate taxes the most volatile. The base is roughly Minnesota's share of corporate profits. So we look at U.S. corporate profits, we figure out what we think Minnesota's share is, and then the econometric forecast model uses U.S. domestic profits to explain Minnesota corporate profits going forward. But even more than individuals, it's a crapshoot about when corporations are going to pay. And then it's another crapshoot about when the receipts are going to show up, because so many big companies get audited, and they're very lumpy payments where there's an audit result and a big bunch of money comes in that we didn't know was going to come in. But roughly, it's driven by changes in corporate profits. This is just a chart of our volatility study. I won't go into it, but you can take that off of our website. It's, our budget reserve report that analyzes volatility. So whenever I'm talking about the forecast, I try to make the point that a forecast is not a guarantee. It's a forecast. And for some of the, I like to talk about the risks so that people understand and can make their own judgments about which risks matter the most. Economic risks that we talked about in the February forecast were household formation. We talked about that. We talked about labor force growth. That wage and salary growth forecast. Monetary and fiscal policy, what's the Federal Reserve going to do? We talked about exports and oil prices. And then there are revenue risks that we talked a lot about, capital gains, the Medtronic merger, and other aspects of capital gains. And that we are forecasting fiscal year 2016, 29 months out from the end of that biennium, for its biennium that hasn't even started yet. So we don't have any of that money in the bank. And then, of course, there's modeling error. This is true for every forecast, that we are not, even if the economy is perfectly forecast, we can't perfectly forecast revenue. And the estimates of the impact of tax law changes, that's done by Minnesota Department of Revenue, there's error in those too, so we're absorbing those. So this might be going a little too far into that, but we're starting to talk more about our errors and looking at the difference between what we forecast for a biennium and what we ended up with for the biennium. That error, positive and negative. And we've looked over time at biennia and averaged that error, where we're looking at the absolute value of the error, so treating positive and negative errors the same. And we also look at the root mean squared error, so we're penalizing big errors more. And what we find is that, and of course, the amount of the error, the percentage of the error gets lower as you get closer to the end of the biennium, right? So for the 14-15 biennium, you're all the way up here for 5 months out from the end, and so there's a very small error at that point because most of the money is in the bank. You don't have all this information. But for 16-17, we're out here at 29 months. What this chart shows is the percentage error. The dark is that mean absolute error, and then the light is the root mean squared error. So for forecasts that is 29 months out, the average root mean squared error is plus or minus 6.6%. And the average mean absolute error is 5.4%. That means that for the forecast that we just did, you can expect by the time we get to the end that it's going to be somewhere between plus or minus 2.8 billion. So the root mean squared error is 2.8 billion up, 2.8 billion down. The mean absolute error is 2.3 billion up, 2.3 billion down. So this is a way that we track our own risk and uncertainty in the forecast, and we compare this to the Congressional Budget Office, and our errors at this moment are lower than their reported errors. Yeah.
How does this chart look for the 5 states in the country?
I don't know. I don't know. I kind of think that maybe Pew might have done a study of that, or conference of state legislatures or something, but I honestly don't know. We only compare ourselves to CBO. And Matt Shepner saw that CBO had done this and then replicated it for us. So I don't know how many states, if they know it, they might not publish it. That's all I have. Some people got their questions answered in the meantime, but I'm happy to.
Could you possibly go back one slide?
And so that modeling, the error that's in that green triangle thing, that's the economic error and it's, or the economic risk, it's taxpayer behavior risk, and it's our estimating risk altogether. And it's Minnesota Department of Revenue's estimating risk. They're estimating the effects of law changes.
So does that then play into the budget reserve?
You know, our budget reserve analysis is different because it's looking at, it's just looking at the volatility of the tax system. And so if you could say, we want to insure against all of that risk, including all of our error, and then you would need a budget reserve, that the budget reserve would be much higher than what we're recommending based on the volatility study alone. And part of the idea there is that we have some control over this. And so, you know, it's not completely out of our control, and so maybe we don't need to insure completely against that.
If there are more questions, could we be here for a few more minutes?
I think.
So we can, if we could, thank our guests. Before we go out, if we don't have your email address, next month, second Wednesday of month in May, who will be speaking on the American Community Survey and of that.
Did you say look at the, what's your name? You're young and Denmark. So you're a regular